Yes, on a Wednesday, friends, it is OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where, of course, interestingly enough, Andy, I was just thinking about this. It's double A, Adam and Andy. Over there, Andy Makowitz. Over here, Adam Armbrecht. And as you just heard it, complaints coming in fast and furious, Andy. The last couple of days, we had some technical glitches, no intro music. The fan base, it was getting pretty ugly out there pretty fast. So enjoy the official theme music back in front as we welcome you in.
I know people were revolting. Backstory, real quick, Adam. A couple of years ago, it took us a long time to figure out which intro music that we needed to pick. Like, we went back and forth for quite a while. It seems like people really like what we're working with. I think it gets people hyped up, and that's really what brings the energy for you. I think they realize that you feed off the energy. When you were a little lethargic the other day, it's because there was no intro music to really get you going.
Could be a real one-to-one ratio there. Not to mention, someone said has an old school kind of vibe to it. So I think that's why we resonate with a handful of people there, as everyone cares about behind the curtain on the introductory music. But as we dive in, we say OTAs are underway here for the New York Football Giants. There's a couple more notes coming out. We said it last episode. These are internal narratives that you take away what you can from them, but don't put too much stock in them. There are some interesting thoughts to have around certain position groups and guys that are being mentioned as having some nice plays, getting some solid reps here over the start of this week. And then, though, there are some potential incoming names as we wondered what is going to happen, key positions that still need more depth, more competition. A couple guys to cover there on the defensive side of the ball, let alone, Andy, updating the cap space as well, because we know moved off of James Bradbury. The dead money is the dead money, but where do they stand underneath the cap and what can they do going forward here if they need to make some adjustments? Let's, though, start with OTAs. Any big notes for you before I dive in on, I think, some little fun tidbits?
No, Adam, to be honest with you, after
Not really. Nothing for me. Nothing for me.
no,
Thanks, guys.
well, listen, and the reason why I say that is because you see day one, they pick like 7 guys that they want to highlight, making a great catch or doing something. And then it's like day 2, it's not necessarily open to the public. They're like, here are the other 4 names that we forgot to mention yesterday that we want to get into here. Like, this person ran in a tremendous route. It's like, okay, I get it. You want to make sure that you're putting these names out there to get Giant fans excited. For me, there wasn't any earth-shattering takeaways, but I don't know. You seem to have a couple of little nuggets that maybe we could chew on a little bit.
Well, we had talked about Alex Bachman yesterday, and I want to bring up David Sills. Like, he's a guy that when we saw some reps from him last year, I think that he flashed a little bit, right? Like, he's the kind of player that when you're looking at the back end of the wide receiver room, you go, well, why not a little more him? Like, what's the harm, right? Now you have Richie James in there, and we know we have Robert Foster in there. But Sills, who's now in his 4th year with the Giants, also has ties going back to Buffalo. So it was noteworthy, I thought, in the sense of back end of that wide receiver group. This is one of those kind of ties, can be the difference between making this roster or finding yourself getting released. Both Richie James was said to have had a lot of nice reps, made a couple of deep catches, good hands. Do you think, I'll frame it this way from an OTA takeaway standpoint, do you think the most important thing that you can hear coming out of this and through the whole summer is that the wide receivers are showing really strong hands? Because Wan'Dale Robinson, by the way, is getting praised specifically in the receiving group as well over OTAs. But don't, like, hands to me. That's all I want to hear. We heard about Bellinger a bit at the tight end position. It's like, all I want to hear is that these guys don't know how to drop passes, because that's been a thread that we can pull on over the last handful of seasons, a lack of reliability from the pass catchers on this roster.
So that's interesting that you said that. Make sure to get the hands on the ball. I love that. I actually have a different thing about the wide receiver room. You keep hearing the name Collin Johnson has been
Yeah,
coming
good
up
rapport
quite a
with
bit,
Daniel Jones. Yeah.
saying he's building a rapport with Daniel Jones. He's a name that we kind of forgot about back in the day. Like, you think about that name, you're like, oh, how old is he? He's 24 years old. He's 6'6", 222. He's that big
Yeah.
bodied, big frame wide receiver. That is intriguing. And for me, what I would love to hear at a camp is one of these guys towards the back end, whether it's Foster, whether it's Austin Prohl, whether it's Colin Johnson, taking this opportunity by the horns and forcing Mike Kafka and Daboll to make a tough choice to put them on the roster. Like, I want one of these guys to push some of these starters like Darius Slayton and be able to say, I am deserving of a roster spot. I don't want to be on the practice squad. Week 1, I want to be out there contributing. If I keep hearing that from Colin Johnson or other players, that's what gets me excited.
What gets me excited is thinking I'm going to sneeze in the middle of a podcast. When we look at this wide receiver group, let's just have a little bit of fun here. you mentioned you want to see someone come out and grab this spot. Alex Bachman's the name that we all think about, but honestly, it's like again, I remember back to how David Sills looked when we saw some of the reps from him. To your point about Colin Johnson, like we even saw him flash a little bit in some limited opportunities. Obviously, a really big bodied guy. Right now, when you look in that depth chart and you see 12 wide receivers listed on that board there, obviously Kadarius Toney, Kenny Galladay, we know that you're going to put Sterling Shepard at least in this moment on the roster to go with Darius Slayton, Wan'Dale Robinson. That makes 5. Richie James would be the next guy listed there. And then it is the Collin Johnson, Robert Foster, CJ Board group. If you could only take, if you could take, say you could take 3, you can include Richie James in there. Do you want, so, Collin Johnson, you go, hey, you'd love to see him push for that roster spot along with Robert Foster. Is there anybody in there that you think should be more deserving of a spot at the back end, or a guy that you'd go, oh man, that's disappointing to see that he's at least not going to be around on this team?
So the name that's interesting to me is CJ Board because he's been around for a while. Uh, it's a tough thing for me to say.
It feels like a guy that got brought back that's going to be one of the first to go, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. I mean, Adam, you almost took the words right out of my mouth. And the reason why is because CJ Board is like, the floor that you're getting with CJ Board. And it's not like crazy high. It's just what you're getting from him. Can he step in a pinch and make a couple catches? Yes. Can he contribute on special teams? Yes. Can he do a punt return? Can he run? Like can he do all these different things that we need? The answer is yes. And I think that was more of the Joe Judge mentality. Like, I kind of just need a guy that's reliable that I could throw into any situation and he'll at least be a 6 out of 10 for me. Whereas I think, the way the NFL is working more and more, it's like, give me the guy that has the special trait or quality or specific thing that could change a game in one play, one situation. So that's why I look at someone like Collin Johnson, who's 6'6". He brings a different dimension. Maybe he's not a special teams guy, but maybe he brings a different dynamic to the offense of a big guy in the red zone that you could throw the ball to, or a guy that maybe can get his body in the way, a la Kenny Galladay, and pick up a tough, third down by putting his body in the way and picking up 7 yards. So for me, I'm actually trying to get away from the Joe Judge mentality of like, just do a little bit of everything okay, and just like give me one thing you do really well, and that will give you a roster spot here.
Well, it's funny because I was even going to say though, and a lot of these guys, like we mentioned about like, can a Robert Foster be a replacement for a Darius Slayton? Just in terms of trait, right? The one thing that you do. That's why I look at Richie James though, and it's not because he's like for like with a CJ Board. It's because Richie James is the small receiver, the quick receiver, right? The explosive guy in the return game. So I check the box in special teams, and then I also have this like for like commodity in and around the Kadarius Toney, Wan'Dale Robinson, Richie James group, right? Like I think I get what you mean in terms of like you want to have guys that have this specific skill set, and then you basically want to like start to stack them. So what if somebody gets hurt? Well, then I just move this guy up the board. It doesn't mean it's going to be like for like in production, but you hope that you have guys that can duplicate the same type of process in a particular role for the team. So interesting to see how that plays out. We'll continue to flesh it out. This is again I think this is the good time to get some thoughts down on paper because another 2 weeks from now, when CJ Board is elevated to the third wide receiver spot, we'll go, well, that was a mistake, or otherwise around it. The other guy that got mentioned here in OTAs was Jahad Ward, who was brought in this offseason. And another name that I think is kind of that, oh, did we maybe like look past this player a little bit when we were putting together the depth chart piece? He's a guy that then when you look over, and this will roll into our discussion around cap room and where the Giants currently stand. When you look inside that defensive unit, I think you start to look at him and say, well, you said at the top, experienced player, brought in by the new regime. And when you start to look at other names just inside of the entire defensive unit, got to make room for these players. The Carter Coughlins and Cam Browns, right? They brought in Jordan Mosley here along the way into the secondary earlier in the offseason. I'm just looking through these names. The O'Shane Ximines, right? Even TJ Brunson, Justin Hilliard, who was here from last year. When you see all of those names and then you hear Ward looks like he knows what he's doing, said he's very vocal, both when he's on the field and on the sidelines, being supportive. Sometimes guys that get brought in with familiarity from other teams are specifically there because they're going to be rah-rah guys. He's one that I just went, oh, yeah, maybe I'm overlooking the fact that he is probably a lot closer to securing a roster spot in OTAs than a lot of these young players that are holdovers.
Yeah, I mean, he's 28 years old. He's 6'5", 287, so he's a big body. And he also fits a real area of need for the Giants. Like, the defensive line is thin after you lose Austin Johnson. You've lost so many different guys.
Mhm.
Dalvin Tomlinson, et cetera, over the last couple of years. But again,
You
we
can throw in
keep
Trent Harris into that group, just mentioning all these guys, like, that you're seeing here, and then it's a lot of young players, on the defensive front that I didn't really get to.
Yeah, but also, I mean, Ward has the inside track for being with the Ravens in 2019 into 2020, and was a guy that Wink Martindale said, "Oh, I really like him a lot." And like, we're going to get into it, especially when we talk about some of the most recent signings for the Giants. Wink Martindale continues more and more to dip back and go back into the well with players that he's familiar with. That either he's like, at the very least, I know they can do X, Y, Z for me because I've seen it before with my own two eyes.
Yeah, and one of the things quickly before we get to those new additions in the secondary that have ties to the Baltimore Ravens, one of the things that and I'll try to put it in the notes here or give a shout out on the next episode. Somebody asked, who are of these undrafted free agents that you think can both make and have an impact on this roster? And we already brought up once before about Corbin. We're going to talk money a little bit and another name here, but just on the defensive side. It's funny when you look into this room here and you mention guys like, Ryder Anderson, another player that was brought in here into the fold, undrafted, got brought in. You have Ellis in there. You have Davidson in there, right? Like, it's interesting to think about that the back end of this entire defensive unit after you have, and Ward is listed, by the way, right now as a starter on this roster. Now, this is by ESPN's draft, and that's the one that you go ahead and take by the wayside of their depth chart. But it's him, Dexter Lawrence, and Leonard Williams. But if you were to look in behind those players, as we said coming into the offseason, Lelos, Moa, Raymond Johnson, like name a dude that you would put up there ahead of Ward, someone that has familiarity on this roster and inside of this system. So it's weird. Like, one of those rookies needs to step up and make a move there. I don't see them necessarily adding another body in that group, unlike over on the secondary side, where we've been batting this around now for a couple of weeks here since, I mean, maybe longer, since the James Bradbury speculation was going, and that was familiar faces that are being brought into the secondary that I think open up to the conversation that I've been saying all along around what are your expectations when they go get another guy? Because go ahead and hit these two players, and we'll break down why I don't think this is as tantalizing as maybe Giants fans hoped.
Yeah, so the Giants signed two cornerbacks. We thought that they were going to bring in veteran depth. One was Maurice Canady, formerly of the Baltimore Ravens, but also of the Dallas. Spent the last 2 years on the Dallas Cowboys. Before that, was on the Jets. Played a little bit sparingly. Had some concussion issues, so didn't really get on the field all that much over the last couple of seasons. Again, another person with Baltimore Ravens ties with Wink Martindale.
Yeah.
As I said, he's a little bit older in terms of 28 years old for the amount of production that he's had out on the field. But he brings that veteran in, knowing that we have so many of these young guys. We talk about Flott and Aaron Robinson, Rodarius Williams, et cetera, that are going to be filling it in. He seems like he obviously has the inner track over the other person that was signed named Khalil Dorsey. Khalil Dorsey, undrafted free agent, Baltimore Ravens again last year. Didn't get on the field, didn't really play all that much
Special
for the
teamer.
team. Yeah, a guy that definitely has special team value. Adam, what I found fascinating about Khalil Dorsey, his college, Northern Arizona, which their mascot is what?
The Peacock. And on,
I mean, come on, it's the Lumberjacks. Everyone
obviously.
knows Northern Arizona is the Lumberjacks,
Everyone knows
Adam.
when you
Come on.
think
I
Northern
mean,
Arizona, you think
it just
lumber.
pops in your head that they're the Lumberjacks in the middle of the desert, right? But I digress. But it is interesting. You see what they're
Sun
doing.
Devils. I wanted to say Sun Devils. Sorry. I wanted to do something that was even remotely close.
Oh, I mean, that would have been even better if you would have done that.
Thank you.
But to be honest with you, you're really starting to see Wink Martindale bring in all of these guys that he's familiar with. We thought that it was going to be Joe Shane bringing in like all these different people that he worked with. That hasn't really been the case. He's kind of been very, diligent in finding people that are really smart, like Brandon Brown across the league that people are respecting. Wink Martindale's like, I had a top 5 defense for quite a while. I'm bringing in guys that I know exactly like what they can give me. You look at Justin Ellis on the roster. You look at Jahad Ward. You look at the two guys that they just brought in Maurice and Khalil. Like, they just continue to bring in more and more Baltimore Ravens. By the time the season starts, there may be like 6 different guys that are on this defensive side of the ball that Wink Martindale has familiarity with.
Yeah, and I think in some ways, like, okay, the first part is it makes a lot of sense because you have a lot of young players, and you just want to have, again, let's get this system rolling. Let's put some roadblocks in front of some young players, right? To say, hey, you want the spot, you can go get it, but I at least have this guy that I have some sense of what he's capable of doing. The other part of it is for me though, and you said Joe Shane, like they brought in a couple of guys, maybe Dable guys, you could say from the Bills, right? On the offensive line. Two biggest areas of need, right? Like the secondary and the offensive line. That's where you're seeing familiarity from the coaching staff saying, I want guys that are reliable there for me, maybe to help us along the way. But when you look at both these names, though, do you want name a guy in the secondary you wanted to cut if they need to keep one of these two players, right? Like, are you elevating either one of them above any of the young talent? Especially because you said CJ Ward, he's 28. Ward older, obviously, too. 28 coming in on the first cornerback you listed there. Like, what you haven't done it. Like, if you haven't proven it by this point, it's not like you're a starting stud, and I don't even mean stud. It's not even like you're a consistent tier 2 cornerback or something where you go, all right, listen, plug him in. At that point, I'd still like to say, barring a total disaster in camp, I'd rather see Aaron Robinson get out there and get the reps, right? Like, so that's my only little wrinkle is like, I get bringing in the familiarity, but I'd hate to see that over the course of camp, some younger player who's going to be on this roster loses out on opportunities to learn and get better.
Okay, good point you bring up. But
Thank you.
here's the thing that I come back to. You're Wink Martindale. You know Khalil Dorsey, right? You've seen him before. He's 24 years old. He's 5'9", 170, can play in the slot. If you've seen enough of Darnay Holmes, like what has Darnay Holmes proven to you if you're Wink Martindale that affords him a roster spot over someone like Khalil Dorsey, who you've seen work and maybe you like their skill set a little better? Darnay Holmes is
Mhm.
5'10". He's got a little bit more size and strength to him than Khalil Dorsey does. Holmes is about 195, almost 200, where Dorsey's 170, so he's a little bit more lighter. But maybe that's what Wink Martindale wants. He wants guys that are a little bit more athletic, that can move around and get creative with the scheme. So when I think about things like that, that's where my mind instantly goes, Adam, is just around whether or not someone like Darnay Holmes, who, by the way, has basically zero guaranteed money on his salary. They could save almost 700 against the cap if they were to release someone like Darnay Holmes.
Yeah.
Just something to think about.
It's interesting too because we got some comments around the secondary, and I was speaking highly about Aaron Robinson and where I thought of him when he was coming out. They drafted him. You've talked about Rodarius Williams. There's the other Williams in the secondary that had a bit more opportunity last year, and he looked pretty good. Some people seem to say, like, I don't know. I'm going to go back and look at it over the course of this week here. That Darnay Holmes, has the ability that he's there, that he can be a contributor. And I think, at least for us anyway, there seems to be a disconnect around the group of players we think that can be on this roster and can be contributors versus guys that I think are further away than closer. And it's like, Julian Love falls into that category. I know where I was when they first drafted him and what I thought he could be. And then every year thereafter, it's not a knock on these guys, but it's just saying I haven't seen enough of it. Now, and again, the caveat with any of these players, and this is why I won't be shocked if somebody like Darnay Holmes, you start to hear his name get mentioned with more consistency making this roster, is because we know it wasn't pretty. It wasn't consistent. There wasn't reliability. I'm talking about from the coaching staff down to the players, right? So I do try to give young players, especially, a little bit more wiggle room when it comes to what did I see from you over the last couple of years versus what I hope you can accomplish for this team going forward.
Yeah, I agree. And you mentioned Julian Love. I think the thing I keep going back to is not necessarily the player. It's, talking about the cap. All we've heard all offseason, and it's been exhausting, Adam, is the cap. What's Joe Shane going to do? How's he going to change it? Darn you, Dave Gettleman, for leaving us in this position. Well, I think it's safe to say that Joe Shane has cleared up the cap. Everyone knows that we have 70, 75 million in cap space, depending on how you want to categorize things for next year. So the Giants are already in a good spot. Joe Shane made a few very tough decisions with guys like Logan Ryan, obviously with Bradbury releasing him, getting things right now and ripping the Band-Aid off as opposed to kicking the can down the road. Adam, I didn't know if you want to talk about, we heard so much about it. Bradbury gets released. We sign all of our free agents to all these different spots. Where are we at? Is there any cause for concern? Do you see some cap casualties? And if so, who are we talking about?
Yeah, I think this is the interesting part, right? Because they make the Bradbury move. And I think in the short term, what it afforded you to do was not have to make any quick decisions. And we basically talked about that, right? Like, how do we avoid putting ourselves in a spot where you need to look at Julian Love or Darius Slayton or getting into some guys that I'm a fan of, like Carter Coughlin, right? Guys that when you look at their contracts, you go, not a lot of guaranteed money, certainly a lot of space for them to be able to operate and make decisions. I I'm a little bit torn here because I don't know if, like, you say the money versus the player, right? Give me a name that's better than whatever Julian Love is right now. That's worth. It's not $2.5 million because it's also going to be whatever you're paying the incoming player, right? It frees up a little bit, but you're obviously giving something out as well. Darius Slayton has been the one we've talked about a lot. Now, can you tell me that any number of these wide receivers show up and you go, well, I already see, and if we include Sterling Shepard in some capacity there, right? We already have 4. Now you're talking about Darius Slayton is in the 5th wide receiver, room here. This is a name that I think makes all the sense in the world because just from a number standpoint and all the other players you have in that particular group, I don't see why you need to hold on to him for 2.5 million. Other than that, though, I think then you start to look at back end roster guys. And this is where some young talent could potentially end up going out the door in favor of maybe, as you just talked about, some veteran guys that Wink wants to keep around, a couple of players that have some experience in Dable's system, maybe as cuts come up here over the course of the offseason. Then I think it's more of the back end guys and maybe not some of these bigger names. And that could include Darnay Holmes because what could he be? You still maybe want to give him that extra chance here as opposed to cutting yourself a little bit short, unlike with a Darius Slayton, who it's the final year. There's no big picture here, and I don't think his short-term value on the roster would necessarily be worth it either.
Well, yes. So you mentioned a couple different guys. I think immediately of OTA and Ximines as one of those guys that you mentioned back into the roster. Hasn't really proven anything so far to
Yeah.
date. Is from a previous regime. The Giants can save about almost under $1 million if they were to outright release him. That's not
But
insignificant.
that's a great but that's a great example though. That's a great example. I'm not saying I'm in love with O'Shane Ximines, but for $1 million, like look at the linebacking room and tell me that you automatically feel ultra confident about whoever else is going to step into that spot there. Right? Like that's the only difference there, as opposed to like if you're going to cut O'Shane Ximines, it should be a little bit further into camp probably. Like once you see that someone else is clearly overtaking him on the depth chart, that he clearly isn't showing the level of dedication or whatever it may be, or doesn't fit the scheme. But it's $1 million. Like it's not, you know what I mean? Like the number has to be bigger and the position needs to be deeper to just automatically be cutting guys away.
Well, but then the way that they're reshaping this roster, you look at a guy like O'Shane Ximines and you look at a guy like Ellerson Smith, who you've highlighted a couple
Yep.
times on the show. I, I firmly believe that only one of them will be on the roster. I don't think you're going to carry both of them on the roster. And for those types of decisions, then the question comes: who has more upside?
Mm-hmm.
And if you have them completely equal, then you do start looking at it and saying, well, one guy's $250,000 less than the other. We could sign practice squad guys, promote and cut people for quite a while with that savings. All things considered, this guy's a little younger, saves us $250,000. Why not go with him? So I think there are those little things that may take into account. Adam, there's a tough name on here that has been mentioned a couple times, but no one wants to talk about because he suffered a debilitating injury. But that guy's Nick Gates, right? I
Oh
don't
yeah.
know. I
Yeah.
don't know how he's going to come back from that gruesome injury that he had. But also, Adam, there's two things that are working against him right now. One is that the Giants can save $2.1 million against the cap if they outright release Nick Gates. That's $2 million that if someone during another training camp or final cuts of a different team, that's $2 million you could put towards a guy that will make this roster and potentially contribute for the Giants, as opposed to what Nick Gates is right now, which happens to be the third string center for the Giants, knowing that they signed Feliciano, knowing that they have Garcia in the building. He feels like a guy, and I hate to say it because it's a terrible injury. Previous regime coming off an injury, saving a bunch of money, third string center. Not many third string centers end up making the roster, right?
No, of course, and he's old. He's older, quote unquote. He's in his late 20s, coming off of that injury. You mentioned when you go out and you get Feliciano and you get Garcia, like you've rebuilt that center position at least in the short term. And Nick Gates isn't young enough to say, even after the gruesome injury, when he gets back healthy, what could he be? No, and it's interesting. I'm sure that if we go in the weeds on it, we're going to find out why the mechanics of releasing him at a certain point is going to be more beneficial to the Giants, maybe than later, or that they're just, again, the organizationally, John Mara, not unlike with a Sterling Shepard, maybe that, there's players on this roster that you go, we don't know if they're really going to have any value to this team going forward, but they have been a part of the organization. We do have some loyalty to them, and we're not just going to outright cut it out from underneath them there at the start of the offseason or at any point. We're going to try to do our best here to give them a soft landing spot, maybe get them a little more guaranteed money, etc. So I expect Nick Gates to go. And inside of that really offensive line group, the interesting ones too, you talk about like where do you free up money, guys that could or could not be here. Like, what happens with Matt Pert? Like, this is a name we're not even mentioning, I think, just because all Giants fans go, well, yeah, sure. We thought he flashed in year number 1. Year number 2 was an absolute disaster. He got overtaken by Nate Solder. Like, who cares about this guy anymore? But can he be better? Like, can he still develop here a little bit underneath this new regime? Or is he a top cut candidate? Ben Bredesen, who was brought in last year in that hodgepodge of offensive line play. And when you look at the back end, the real question becomes a guy like Marcus McCathan, more developmental. He's a year or two away potentially. So is he not even really being talked about as being on the starting roster? He's going to be a practice squad guy. You walk through some of these players, Revis in there as well. Shane Lemieux, we mentioned yesterday, coming back from that injury. There's a lot of names inside of this offensive line group that I think need to flesh themselves out. And then you mentioned the biggest piece of any of these positions. It's who comes available, right? Who offers you a little bit more reliable depth at any position, offensive or defensive side of the ball. And then if you think, well, there's consistency here versus question mark, that's what I think the Giants are going to try to accomplish in any of these little market moves that they're going to make. It's not going to be big dollars, but it's the ability to say, we just got a little bit more reliable. And that was the point about the two corners on the defensive side of the ball, right? We got a little more reliability, a little more consistency in terms of guys that know this system. I would expect the same thing across that offensive line there. And say nothing of one little nugget of a name that we didn't even get to this offseason so far.
Yeah, I mean, listen, the idea of Cam Brown, TJ Brunson, all those different guys on the back end at him,
You mentioned too
I'm
around the OTA and Ximines conversation, like Brunson, like even Crowder. It's like what are these guys? Like Tay Crowder, who's played big reps. Like what is he? What is he relative to this defense and to what this team is going forward? Like I think that if you're good enough, no matter how bad a team is, if you're good enough to be starting, even with injuries and everything else, if you were good enough to be starting, then that means you should be good enough to have a role. I think, right? Like, but on the other hand, you go, but you weren't particularly good when you were starting. So how many other teams around the league would you have been the backup inside the middle of a linebacking core in a 3-4 scheme? Or would you have been fighting for a backup spot? And that changes the mentality around where do you go from? Is it OTA and Ximines, who's been okay, more of a backup, but not so good, little bit of money available, or a Tay Crowder, a TJ Brunson that you go, yeah, that was at a necessity, maybe even more than talent or skill. And where do they fit into our scheme? And I'm not offering definitive statements on any of them, but that's why when you look at these groups, you go, boy, man, I really need to see some tape from camp here. I need to get some sense of where these guys are in this coaching staff system and scheme, not these weird perceptions we have of them from arguably one of the worst eras in recent memory for Giants.
And that's where the back end of the roster really is going to have some significant turnover at him. I think it's easy to kind of think of it this way. At the end of the day, it's like you look at a guy like Carter Coughlin, you look at a guy like Cam Brown, you look at a guy,
take his name out your mouth.
You look at a guy like Trent Harris. These are all guys that were back end roster type guys that very easily could Darren Beavers just overtake Carter Coughlin. Like he's already passed him on the depth chart and was one of the last picks for the Giants in the draft. You can see that they're already shaping the back end. Don't be surprised if in the coming weeks, it's not going to happen during camp because you don't have to make any of these cuts yet. But don't be surprised if some of these names that you were familiar with last year are all of a sudden being released for some of these young undrafted free agents or 6th-round draft picks that we just had from this past year.
Well, you mentioned Fox there yesterday, right, in that defensive unit there in the linebacking core, and I think that's almost the like for like with some of these back end guys, right? You say, and by the way, like when you look at it, when you're talking about the strong side linebacker, it's Ojulari, it's Ximines, it's Ellerson Smith, it's Fox. Like that's just that's the rundown, the totally non-discriminate depth chart rundown. Okay, so is Fox more or less intriguing to this staff than Ellerson Smith was to last year's staff? You want Ellerson Smith to have every opportunity. I think that he can, but he's a later round pick, right? Like what are we really talking about when you look in that room? And then if you add O'Shea and Ximines into that group of the what ifs, so are we talking about only having one legitimate starting, outside linebacker, edge rusher across from our new stud in Thibodeau? Like, that's how thin things get very quickly. So it'll be interesting to see. I think the Giants have done a nice job here bringing in competition at every level of the depth chart so that it's almost like for like, right? It's like saying, hey, back end guy for back end guy. If we like our player better, fine. And if you beat him out, good for you. And that goes, as we were talking there at the top, a lot about the wide receiver group. All of those players that we've mentioned before, Board and Sills and Bachman, right? Hey, you're all there. And guess what? We brought in Foster and James, right? Like we brought in all these other players that they can just go ahead and take your spots. And if you earn them, you keep them, great. but there's no love loss here moving on from some of these guys, especially if you're making the money work. One player we didn't get to, we'll talk about him tomorrow. Just wanted to make a point to mention because we talked about it in the pre-show and then didn't quite get there. And that's going to be on the offensive side of the ball, on the offensive line. I want to try to make sure that I get do his name right. Roy Mbakiti, a Nigerian player brought in under the wing of the watchful wing of OCU and Yora. This is another one of those international player examples. He got mentioned in OTAs by Brian Dable, saying he has a long way to go. He's learning football in a lot of ways. But we'll talk about tomorrow a little bit the money that's being guaranteed to some of these guys. We mentioned it about Corbin and how that can be indicative of the way the organization in the short and long term feels about them. You can. In the meantime, though, friends, follow us over on YouTube, where, as we say, continues to just be a windfall of comments and support and conversation, and hopefully a lot of fun watching us dive in on all these different topics. So do that, get the podcast review, get those needs fulfilled. And as Andy Makowitz would want, need, and nay on the return of the theme music, demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.